Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Maurice Jones, the City Manager for the City of Charlottesville, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this session on urban futures, where our talented speakers will take on some of the big questions facing cities, both small and large, in our driverless future. As a local government administrator, I'm well aware of the sometimes glacial pace that localities take in responding to changing trends. Many of us are still trying to figure out how best to deal with the sharing economy, for instance. Uber and Airbnb and the ramifications of their arrival on the scene caught many of us and our friends at the state level by surprise. But in our defense, I think we are becoming a bit more nimble in embracing new technology, identifying future trends, and preparing for them. In our session this afternoon, our three speakers will provide us with their insight on how communities throughout our country will need to adjust to what promises to be a seismic shift in our way of life and how we should be planning for this exciting future. It's an honor to introduce our panelists in the order of their presentations this afternoon. Andrew Mondschein is an assistant professor of urban and environmental planning at the University of Virginia's School of Architecture. He studies transportation systems and travel behavior, seeking to foster equitable, sustainable accessibility in cities and regions. He addresses a rapidly changing terrain of transportation and information technologies, identifying means to assert social imperatives during a period of engineered urban transformation. Recent projects of his include community-based control of local streets during vehicle automation, web-based cognitive mapping approaches to understanding walkability and well-being in Delhi, India, and wearable mobile sensing to enable community-centered planning and design in urban streets. Andrew teaches a range of transportation courses as well as master's and PhD methods. He received a BA in architecture from Yale University and an MA and PhD in urban planning from UCLA, and he also practiced as a transportation and land use planner at Gruen Associates in Los Angeles. Donna Chen is an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Virginia. Her research focuses on sustainable transportation systems, in particular, the impacts of new vehicle technology systems on travel behavior and the environment, travel demand modeling, transportation economics, and vehicle and bicycle crash safety. Her most recent research examines the impact of a fleet of self-driving electric vehicles that continuously serve sequential trip demand. She is a member of the Transportation Research Board's Committee on Alternative Transportation Fuels and Technologies and the American Society of Civil Engineers Transportation and Development Institute Committee on Public Transit. Prior to joining academia, she worked in the consulting industry as a transportation planning engineer and has experience with roadway design, cost estimation, and traffic operation analyses. Greg Rogers is a policy analyst at the Eno Center for Transportation and the assistant editor of Eno Transportation Weekly. In this dual role, he has advised Congress, the U.S. Department of Transportation, and state governments on creating policies for autonomous vehicles. Greg has been on the front lines of reporting on AV policies across the country and is a co-host of the Mobility Podcast. Please join me in welcoming our three panelists this afternoon. And Andrew Mondschein will kick off our presentation.
All right. Thank you very much, Maurice. I'm very glad to be here. And what I'd like to do is start off the afternoon by talking about the effects that driverless vehicles might have on cities and how we might actually deal with some of those issues. So in order to do that, I want to talk a little bit about how I think we can all think about the context around driverless vehicles in cities, what the implications of driverless vehicles are for cities, and then what we can actually do, both things that we probably should be doing right now and also thinking about for the future. So I think that one of the most important ways to think about the future is to look to the past. And I think that, in fact, Good for the historians in the room. But I think that one of the most important things we need to do is remember that 100 years ago, when the first automobility revolution came along, it wasn't something where technology just magically appeared and just changed the way streets operated forevermore. It was an active process. And in fact, we have a historian here at UVA, Peter Norton, who wrote a book called Fighting Traffic that talks all about the fact that city managers, planners, policymakers, and communities made a choice to change the way the streets operated. In that case, really to take it away from all of the things that used to happen in streets, like walking, and to put it in the hands of vehicles. And I think there's an opportunity, again, to think about what that means for us now. There's also a history about 50 to 70 years ago of suburbanization, of after World War II making decisions to invest in infrastructures that allowed us to solve an actual housing crisis after World War II through suburbanization. And now again, of course, we're faced with a new housing crisis in many cities here in Virginia and around the country. And how are we going to solve that problem? And do driverless vehicles have something to do with solving that problem for better or for worse? And I'll talk more about both the good and the bad on that side as we go forward. So the other aspect of all of this is really, well, you've heard people talk about the technologies. You've heard people talk about some of the potential ways we can utilize those technologies, but how does it all add up for cities? Well, one of the things we need to keep in mind is, well, does this change the way we drive today? Well, the research I think you might have heard already, but it does. The estimates are the amount of driving could go up in the sense that the capacity of roadways might go up anywhere from 25% to 500%. There's a lot of broadness to that estimate, but we know it's up. The ease of travel should increase. We fundamentally know this, right? If we have a level 5, which means all the way fully automated vehicle, that means we're not doing anything but hanging out in a vehicle. And so that's going to feel really different. And of course, for good and for ill, but mostly for a lot of good, the young and old will travel more on roads. And I think that that means a lot for who uses city streets. So the other side, it's not all about the driving itself. It's about pedestrians. It's about bicyclists. We have some interesting innovations and thoughts that we might think about. Do driverless vehicles that are safer, this amazing benefit that they provide, make pedestrians and bicyclists feel better about being on sidewalks and streets? That might happen, and that could be really good. Do the efficiencies we gain from parking, from actually not having to use parking lots as much as we do in central cities, allow us to densify, to make walkable places denser and actually put destinations closer to one another? Those are all possibilities that driverless vehicles make possible. And transit, which we'll hear a little bit more about, and how we actually get people around as a service, that may go up or go down. There's a lot of questions behind it. So I want to tell you a little bit about how I've been thinking about what this all means for cities. And the way that I've looked at it in one project called Reprogramming Mobility has really been around the fact that it's not just about technology, it's about governance and it's about behavior as well. And when we look at all of those things at the same time, what we get are possibilities. So I want to talk a little bit about the possibilities and how we might approach some futures that we may really want or we may not be so happy about. So if we extend present trends, and you know, my co-authors and I, we kind of thought about, you know, assigning cities that we all know pretty well to the future in some ways. We could go anywhere from Atlanta to Boston and maybe beyond. But Atlanta, as you might not be surprised to think about, is sprawl, but sprawl doubled down. And if we don't do very much with our land use planning and other aspects that we have to control here in cities, we might just see that, oh, you know, if we can have better mobility but not do anything about housing, well, people might say a 3-hour commute isn't so bad if I'm not actually, you know, behind the wheel itself. And that's one possibility. But then, Los Angeles, by the way, is just things not working out very well at all. So I'll skip on to New Jersey, which actually you may or may not be surprised to hear this, but is a place of small railroad towns, of towns built around centers. And in this scenario, what if we decide that we want to continue that dense development in the centers and really control growth around the center and manage the type of mobility that we provide so that driverless mobility is actually a public service as well and integrated with existing rail and growing rail service, we might have a future that's actually really much like what we might envision in a lot of these, in a lot of the visions we have in our community plan, for example, here in Charlottesville itself. we can do that. We could go from Atlanta to New Jersey. And Boston, by the way, is basically the Matrix. It's the drones that we've heard about. It's delivering anything we want through drones and virtual reality, which those technologies are there as well, so that we can live ever more densely, smaller packed communities, sort of like Boston or New York, but even more on steroids to some degree. All of those things are possible is the point, and it's the policies we set that matter. So what can we do? So how do cities actually control what is possible from driverless vehicles? Well, we can do things that deal with land use and the street itself, and we can encourage policies at the regional and federal level as well. So I think it's important to say that if we look at this map of commuting in Virginia from 2012, there's already a lot of places very close to Charlottesville where on average people commute more than 30 miles a day one way. That's a lot of driving that already occurs. And so we have to think about what connected automated vehicles will do for that. Will Charlottesville be a bedroom suburb for Northern Virginia? Will Richmond be a bedroom suburb for Hampton Roads? Or will even Roanoke be a bedroom suburb for Northern Virginia? These are questions we need to consider seriously. And what we can do about it might be visiting things like growth boundaries, policies that actually help us say what we want to happen in a context that we never expected to face. Statewide, Commonwealth-wide, countrywide, region-wide, those are some of the policies we need to think about. And I think it begins in Charlottesville and other cities looking at our land use and deciding what we really want to preserve and what we really are, where we are really willing to accommodate development. We do that already, but I think we have to be prepared for an influx of people coming for, the quality of life or in some cases affordability. It depends on where you are. So there's a land use policy side to it. Let's see where I can click. But then there's the street as well. And I think there are some important considerations where we need performance standards for streets that are adequate to driverless vehicles. So it's not just about speeds, but it's also how close can a driverless vehicle get to a bicycle or to a pedestrian. It's do we set actual minimum occupancy standards for vehicles to say we don't want zero occupancy vehicles on our streets. There are all kinds of things to consider that cities do have some control over. And I think we need to be thinking about how we implement those tools already at our disposal. So I want to end on a not just a warning note, because I think there are things to think about, but also a really hopeful note as well. There are some exciting possibilities that automating mobility and connecting mobility provide to us. It's not just about managing traffic, and it's not just about safety, although that is incredibly important. It's about extending trends that are really good in cities right now and using driverless vehicles to actually push those even further. So for example, today we think about these things, good word or not, tactical urbanism or reclaiming parking and curbsides for parks and for activities, even food trucks, things like night markets, all of these ways that we use the public right-of-way, which is what the street is, in flexible ways. Well, driverless vehicles actually present an opportunity for flexibility that has not existed for 100 years, since we hyper-regulated the street when vehicles arrived in the first place. And so when human drivers are no longer behind the wheel, and maybe this isn't 3 years from now, maybe this is 20 years from now, or whenever our amazing technologists get us there, we might think about, well, do we need to have roadways that a human driver is expecting to function, or can we actually program in complex networks that meet the needs of communities? And so to give you a vision of this, I think it's a little funny to go back to 1895, but when the street was actually a place where people could play, they could play kickball, in this case it's probably stickball, they could shop, they could walk around, they could see their friends and neighbors. We do that already through all these amazing things happening in cities like Saturday streets, Sunday streets, all kinds of ways we close streets for periodic purposes. What if communities, through technology, could control that on their own? What if we could build that in as a given right to communities to have public rights-of-way as their front yards again? It's kind of amazing to think what we can do with the technology of cars where people aren't driving and networks of information technologies that allow us to one day decide we're going to play kickball on our street and it's going to be safe. Like I remember doing Wow, I'm sounding very nostalgic. It's kind of funny. But, that I remember doing as a kid. Or what would it mean if we want to have a night market on a street? We could program that, and we could reserve that. And driverless vehicles make it much easier than when we have to rely on human drivers who only know maybe one or two ways to get somewhere. So I will leave it at that for now because I want to hear from our other speakers. But I think to say, AVs are just a technology. What's important are the decisions we make and how we use that technology. And I think if I can make any warning is that the time is now for cities to make those choices because it'll probably be too late in 20 to 25 years. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity to come and speak.
Thank you, Andrew. And while Donna comes up to prepare for her talk, just wanted to make sure that you all understood that we're going to go through each one of the presentations, and then we'll have significant time for Q&A after that. So, Donna?
Thank you, Maurice. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys today. I just wanted to make a note that, by the way, Andrew is a huge foodie. I have tasted his homemade brisket, and it is awesome. So apparently, if we have driverless vehicles, he will be starting a food truck where you can maybe taste his brisket as well. So my name is Donna Chen. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering here at the University of Virginia. I'm here to sell you on the idea that driverless vehicle is a future where you're not only free from the idea of sitting in your vehicle and having to drive and having to be in congestion, but the idea that you can be free from vehicle maintenance, from having to go wash your car every once in a while when it's dirty, from having to think about maintaining this very expensive capital investment that we all currently are tied to. And all it does is sit there and depreciate when we don't use it. So our speaker from, I think, Uber and Lyft mentioned earlier about the idea of shared mobility. But right now, Lyft and Uber, as Colin showed in his slideshow, is primarily being used as a supplementary mode. And by that, I mean people use Uber and Lyft, often late at night when they go out to the bars. It's really great for decreasing driving under the influence. But so far, shared mobility in its current form has not made a dent in urban congestion the way we know it. Because as traffic planners, we're mostly concerned about that driving to work hour in the morning, that driving home hour in the afternoon when congestion is at its worst. And my group at University of Virginia has been focused on trying to model what does it mean to have pervasive shared mobility in a city-wide model where this mode can take you anywhere. So if we think about the idea that, I think up until this point, the vehicle has been very much so a defining part of someone's identity, right? What you drive. There's a very big identity issue with whether you are a sports car driver, whether you have a commuter vehicle. But this is really changing. As we have urban congestion, as people are wasting more hours sitting away, frustrated at traffic, vehicles are becoming more and more utilitarian, or the perception of them really are. And now, with smartphone technology and the shared economy, really what we value is access. Not necessarily the vehicle itself, but the ability to complete a trip and get to the destination we want. So we can think about a future where we have a fleet of shared autonomous electric vehicles, what our research group calls SAEVs, that will be available for all to use. And you just summon this vehicle, right, from your smartphone, and it comes to you as you need it. So if we're able to do that, and that's great if you're able to have access to mobility whenever you would like, we can add this additional component called ride sharing. So this is when we say, all right, if you have a common origin or a common starting point and a common destination, then you can share a ride with someone. So if you see this red vehicle here, it's going to pick up the passenger at D1 at its origin, then going to pick up passenger 2 at origin 2, and then dropping off the first passenger at the destination D1, and then the second passenger at the destination D2. And if we do this, and we have modeled this with 10% of all urban travel demand in Austin and in Seattle, the number of trips one of these vehicles can serve in a day is 8 to 13 times the number of trips a privately owned vehicle that is driven manually can serve. And let me explain that a little bit. So right now, you have, let's say you own your vehicle. How many trips on average do you think that vehicle drives on an average day? Any guesses? I'm sorry? 3. Perfect. 3.01. So close. Yes. 3 trips a day, and the rest of the time, your vehicle is sitting in a garage, in a parking lot, just wasting away, depreciating. So in this case, when these vehicles can sequentially serve traffic, so once it picks you up, picks up someone else going the same way, drops you guys off, goes on to picks up the next person, these vehicles are serving roughly 24 to 39 trips a day, if my math is correct, in an urban area. And so this is really great, right? So we can greatly reduce our parking capacity or parking needs. But the trick is, because these are autonomous vehicles, and after they drop you off, they must go pick someone up, they will be about 15 to 20% of the times they're driving, those miles are empty. There's no one in the vehicle. And that's going to be quite a sight to see, because that's something that we don't see today. But what I want to emphasize here is that we may see this future where we say, oh, wow, that vehicle is driving with no one in it. What a waste of space. But in reality, if we introduce ride sharing, even though some of the miles are empty, we are still adding system efficiency. And let's put it this way. Even if we did not have ride sharing, even if it was just you calling your own private autonomous vehicle coming to pick you up and drop you off, and you don't want to share your ride with anyone else, these vehicles can still replace roughly 4 to 7 privately owned vehicles with about 10% empty vehicle miles traveled. So 1 in 10 miles we drive will be about empty. But if we do, and if we're successful in introducing ride sharing and getting that to be a culturally pervasive phenomenon, and everyone's very open to the idea of ride sharing, from a system perspective, if we can match all of your rides, about 35% of all vehicle miles traveled will have at least 2 passengers. So think about that. 1 out of 3 miles traveled, is going to be a shared ride. So when we're looking at dynamic ride sharing, we said, wow, this is great. Who's going to need to own a car anymore? Will people still take buses because now you can, share rides on demand? So we started looking at the fact that as you share rides with more and more people, there's going to be additional times, right, associated with going a little bit out of the way to pick up that other person. There's going to be more miles traveled that way. So in this system, from an operator's perspective, if I was Uber or Lyft, I would want to put as many people into these vehicles as possible, because as these 2 graphs show, your fleet size and charging stations, because this is an electric fleet, dramatically decrease as you increase the number of occupants in the vehicle. That's what's 1, 2, 3, 4 on that bottom line. That's the number of people in the vehicle. However, as a passenger, my average wait time and travel time increases as you increase the occupancy in a vehicle. And as you get to approximately the addition after the second passenger, so when you get to a 3rd or 4th passenger, those benefits of ride sharing start to disappear compared to the additional costs of extra travel time and travel miles. And your wait times will increase from average 11 minutes to something like 20 minutes. So we ask ourselves, would you really do that? So then we thought, so we want to be able to put more people in a vehicle efficiently. Where are some examples where that's already occurring? Oh, it's called transit. We already have that, right? So we said, okay, so maybe what we want to do is to be able to use these shared autonomous electric vehicles to get more people to transit, which is a system that we have been operating for decades and works well during peak hours in most places. So we said, if you think about transportation on the scale of flexible to fixed transportation, where flexible, there can be more individual transportation, and as you get more collective, it's going to be more fixed, which what our models show makes sense. At the upper right-hand corner, the most collective and the most fixed is your existing transit systems. Your bus rapid transit, your train systems, they work very well. So we want to be able to have a fleet that then increases access to public transit. So here we're thinking about the idea of, right now, what is it that prevents you from wanting to ride the bus? Let's say the Charlottesville example. Well, I don't live anywhere near a bus stop, and I can't walk to a bus stop that's 3 miles away. That's a very reasonable reason to not take a bus. Why else? Well, the bus only comes every 30 minutes. I have to make this trip. It's only 10 minutes long. I'm not going to wait 20 minutes for a bus that only comes every 30 minutes. Very true as well. But these are problems in the transit system that can be helped if we can bring more riders to the transit system. If we have more ridership, then we can offer that bus service more frequently. So now it comes every 10 minutes, every 5 minutes, and you don't have to wait the 30 minutes to catch the next bus. So in our models, we were working with Seattle data. We looked at one particular problem. So in some cities, they have this idea called a park and ride. You're probably familiar if you've been to DC. So they say, all right, you can't walk to the bus bus stop or the train station. So what we're going to do is provide parking for you to drive your individually owned cars and park at a parking lot and then hop on to the train system. However, they're experiencing problems with this. Number one, these parking lots are getting full. So they're getting so much demand from these park and rides that the parking lots are full, and then when the next person comes, they're having trouble securing parking. And they say, well, if I can't find a parking spot for my car, I then can't take the train. What do I do? Secondly, these lots are very expensive to maintain. The Seattle statistics is on average, a spot like this costs $8 per day to maintain. $8 per day to supplement one round-trip transit, because someone comes in the morning, parks their car, right, gets on the train, goes to work for the day, their car is sitting in the parking lot, they come back on the train, take their car, and go. And if that parking spot is free, in terms of maintenance and capitalized costs over the life cycle, it's $8 per day. That's not a smart financial model. So we thought, all right, so here's a perfect application for shared mobility. Let's get these cars out of these parking lots and bring the people into these stations on shared mobility services. So if we do this, we can imagine in a city like Charlottesville, so here's an animation of our simulation, we have created a station. I don't have a laser pointer here. I don't. If you'll notice in the lower right-hand corner, there's a red spot where these vehicles are going. The blue spots with the people in them, those are all the passengers requesting a trip. The green moving bubbles are vehicles that have capacity and are on their way to pick up a passenger. And then the red moving things are vehicles that are full. So if you watch, I think there's a vehicle going to the transit station soon. So if a red vehicle approaches the transit station, they then will drop off the riders and then become green again and become available. So when we simulate this, so I made this nice graphic in Charlottesville, but our actual simulation was done based in Seattle data around a train station called Tukwila Station. And we used 2016 data for a roughly 7.5 mile by 6 mile service area. We found that one shared vehicle with dynamic ride sharing can replace 20 to 34 park and ride vehicles. One vehicle getting rid of 20 to 30 parking spots at a park and ride. That is a huge impact. And that's using existing demand. That's who's currently using the train station because they're willing to drive to the train station and ride the train. Imagine if you had a service like this, all the other people that might consider using the train because they weren't able to drive and park at the station before. So I'm going to show engineering professor here. I've got to show a couple of charts. So I wanted to compare these results to what if you did not have ride sharing. So here I have occupancy. In the top pie chart, that's occupancy with ride sharing. So the darkest color there, 20.33%, that's the number of empty vehicle miles traveled, so the vehicle is traveling empty. And as you go lighter in color, that's occupancy, 1 passenger, 2 passenger, 3 passenger, 4 passengers. So as you can see there, 40 to 45% of travel actually carries 2 or more passengers. That's more than the citywide case where I said it was 35%. And why is that? Well, it's actually pretty easy. As it turns out, when your passengers have either a common origin or a common destination, it's easier to carpool. Makes sense? But if you compare that to the non-ride share case, that's the bottom graph. If you only allowed 1 passenger in each of these vehicles, then you would have 38% empty vehicle miles traveled, and then about 61% of the time when these vehicles are traveling with 1 person. We can also look at this in terms of how it may help congestion. So here I have a graph of use by time of day. So on the x-axis or the horizontal axis, we have hours in operation all the way from 4 a.m. until midnight. That's when the system was in operation. The top is a graph of what happens when we have shared rides. So the solid line you see at the very top, so you see there's more rides at the 8 a.m. peak, morning peak, and more rides in the afternoon peak about 18, which is what, 4 p.m. or 6 p.m. The solid line shows the number of passenger vehicle miles traveled. So that's how many miles there is someone occupied in the vehicle. That dashed line you see right below it is the number of vehicle miles traveled. So just because you see on that graph, the black line is actually higher. We have more passenger miles traveled than we have vehicle miles traveled because we have ride sharing, right? So during the peak hours, ride sharing is more prevalent. Compare that to the non-ride sharing case, which case the dashed line is much higher than the solid line, showing you that when you don't have ride sharing, during the peak hours, you have much more empty vehicle travel which is the last thing you want. You're adding more to congestion because you've got these vehicles driving around empty during times when you have the worst congestion. All right. So with that, I'm going to wrap up with my conclusions. There are many different implementations for these shared autonomous electric vehicles to impact the future of urban mobility. If we use them instead of driving our own privately owned cars, we can greatly reduce parking infrastructure. If we add a ride-sharing component, we can reduce congestion and, of course, transport-related urban emissions. And if we use these to complement existing transit, get that bus to work more frequently, we can potentially increase transit ridership, and that will result in more equitable transportation access for all populations. So my question to you is, are you ready for this transportation revolution? Thank you.
First of all, thank you for having me here. My name is Greg Rogers, and I'd like to start off by telling you a story. So what we're going to do is we're going to go 100 years in the past first, and we're going to get back to the basics of transportation, and then we're going to head back into the future. This is William P. Eno. He was traumatized by traffic in the late 1800s. And I think we're all somewhat traumatized by traffic, but it was a special case for him because it was late 1800s, and he went into the city with his mom in a horse and buggy, and in this roundabout. And as you can imagine, horses were making a mess, as it were, and there was a lot of congestion. And he was looking every which way down all of the roads that connected the roundabout, and they're empty. But all of these horses and buggies are just stuck in one place. So he came up with one crazy revolutionary idea. What if we just stop so that people can go, and we take turns, effectively sharing the road? So William P. Eno ended up writing the first rules of the road, and these were adopted in New York City in 1909, thanks to his trauma. This was what established the world's first city traffic plan, and then it was adopted very quickly afterwards. And the reason this is important, and Andrew mentioned this before, it's that government has a critical role to play, and the way that we formulate our policies has a really critical role to play. And not only managing our infrastructure, not only building our infrastructure, but creating the new rules of the road. And these government roles have evolved over time. States were the first ones to create gas taxes because they needed to have more funding to create paved roads that would actually facilitate automobiles traveling around. And the states were the first to actually institute gas taxes. Oregon in 1919 started, and over the next decade, every other state passed it, and then, of course, as usual, the federal government kind of comes along a decade later and says, oh, okay, we should probably do this. And then President Eisenhower in 1956 created the interstate highway system. So here's why this is important. It's over the last 100 years, the fact is that we've been watching how government plays a critical role in transportation, and this is still going to be true. But I just want to leave you with one thing, if nothing else. It's that the future of transportation isn't going to be that remarkable. There will be autonomous vehicles. There'll be self-driving cars. We already have self-driving cars. I don't know if you're familiar, but you can download Uber and Lyft, and that car will drive itself for you. And then whenever you're riding in a self-driving car, the fact is that when you get into it, if it's scary or exciting to ride in, we probably didn't do it right. They're going to be safe, and they're going to be underwhelming for the most part. So I have two half-truths to share with you. It's that government is capable of innovating, and government is not. This is how we approach this, the Eno Center for Transportation. We're an independent, nonpartisan think tank, and we work with people who are transportation professionals, who are policymakers, who are regulators, and automakers and tech firms. What we try to do is build consensus around creating sound policies for autonomous vehicles and every other mode of transportation, but our focus recently has been on autonomous vehicles, or AVs, and we just released a report earlier this year called Beyond Speculation. We brought a ton of tech firms, automakers, policymakers together and figured out how to create the best policies to enable AVs to safely develop. And out of this, we developed some best practices for federal government and states as well. And just for our purposes here, we'll be skipping over this, but the federal government is responsible basically for making sure that you can buy a vehicle in California, you can drive it all the way across the country to New York without having to stop and get it re-inspected and having any of these other issues. They will continue to do this by focusing on how autonomous vehicles are safe. And for that reason, the focus of cities should instead be on how can we give them a safe environment to operate in. The objective of a state is to say, how can we manage our roadways better to allow them to operate? We also work with Virginia DOT on creating sort of a list of best practices for allowing a state to adopt autonomous vehicles. And this involves the state really maintaining their infrastructure and focusing on how do we have an environment that encourages innovation but promotes safety. So what can cities like Charlottesville do to prepare for AVs? I'll start by saying, again, it's not about focusing on just the exciting parts. It's about getting all of your stakeholders together and deciding what your goals are. And then maintaining your roads properly. Autonomous vehicles don't need a bunch of fancy infrastructure to operate. Every time automakers go before Congress, all the members will ask, so what do you need for autonomous vehicles? And every time they say, no potholes, no fading lines, and adequate signs. We don't need a ton of fancy infrastructure. What we need are things that can actually benefit all road users. And continue to provide public transit services and look at how AVs can interact with this larger ecosystem of transportation. And AVs are just not a silver bullet. There is no silver bullet in transportation. There's still going to be congestion even if you expand a highway. We need to look at it as a whole holistically. But here's some actionable things that cities should be doing. First of all, it's creating pilot programs, like the ones that Donna mentioned, that these are the way that we sort of get this better understanding of how to implement the technology. Establishing road use fees, we'll get into this in a second, and then creating shared use mobility zones or some zones. With pilot programs, the city should always start with a goal in mind. It should always start with why are we trying to address this issue? Why do we want to incorporate an AV? And then ask, how do we want to do it? Do we want to have it connect to transit stations, transit stops? Do we want to be reducing the amount of miles traveled? And then what should we use? Should we use a driverless shuttle? Should we use a driverless bus? And then look at all the other alternatives. Arlington, Texas was one of the best examples of this in that earlier this year they signed an agreement to rent 2 driverless shuttles that can carry about 12 people. But before this, Arlington sort of had this legacy as being the largest city in the U.S. that didn't even have a public transit system. But they were trying to reimagine, how do we improve those connections between all the places that people want to go, and how do we make it easier to operate sort of our entertainment systems and connect people to their parking structures. So that's one good example of seeing how you can actually incorporate this new technology. Infrastructure funding is always been an issue. Figuring out where the city is going to get the money to replace potholes and to repair the roads is difficult. And the federal gas tax hasn't been increased in 25 years. And as electric vehicles are being put on the road, there's less and less revenue coming from the gas tax. So I'm going to make a radical proposal as we establish a road use fee. Because vehicles are going to be connected, because they're going to be automated, because we have these computer systems in them, what we can do is we can have basically tracking of how many miles they've been driving. We can track the number of miles, and you can also manage how much a driver has to pay in road use, basically taxes, based upon when they're driving, if they're driving during rush hours, and use other sort of carrots and sticks. And the way this would work is, imagine that you purchase your vehicle from Audi, for example, and it's an automated vehicle from Audi. The vehicle is driving you, and you will probably be, with the way that these services are being imagined, you'll probably be paying a subscription fee for them. So the automaker would then track the amount of miles you were traveling, factor in any demand-based pricing. So if Charlottesville says we don't want to have vehicles driving on the road during 6 to 8, we want to disincentivize driving between 6 and 8 a.m., they can do that. And then carrots and sticks. One good example is if you're sharing the road, if you're sharing your vehicle, maybe you would pay less in your road use fee. There are ways to incentivize this and to sort of tinker with this. Last part is think about parking. Curbside space is always under contention, how we use it in our cities. And as Donna mentioned earlier, about 1/3 of traffic is caused by non-recurring incidents. I used to be a Uber and Lyft driver in 2015. I did what any good millennial would do. I quit my job as a lobbyist where I was very comfortable. And I called my mom and I said, Mom, I'm going to be a blogger. She said, oh, okay. What are you going to blog about? Well, self-driving cars. How are you going to pay the bills? I guess I'll drive for Uber and Lyft or something. And so I did it full-time for 6 months. But one of the things that I always had trouble with was finding a place where I could pick up passengers in Washington, D.C. There's no curb space. And what happened was, inevitably, I would get a call, and I would pull up to the location. The person obviously wouldn't be outside yet. And I'd have to just put my hazard lights on and just sit there. Cars honking behind me, taxi drivers just making obscene gestures at me. And one of the things that I realized was that we're not looking at how our use of curb space is shifting. Uber and Lyft drivers need to be able to pick folks up. E-commerce means that there are even more deliveries happening with FedEx and UPS, et cetera, and Amazon now at this time. And then AVs are going to change sort of the trip structure. So if we look at it, this is Gramercy Park in Manhattan. You see there are 45 spaces for parked cars and then 3 for commercial trucks. And then there is a bicycle lane going down here. Now you can see all these spaces are full. And this red zone is just commercial loading. But if you look closely, you can see right where the red line starts, there is also a commercial truck parked in the middle of the road, even though there's a loading zone there. It's causing unnecessary congestion. So what if we rethink this? What if we set curb space aside and create some zones, or shared use mobility zones? An Uber Lyft driver can quickly pull in and drop you off without having to stop in the middle of the road. The truck drivers during the day can do deliveries in that spot. And then when we have AVs, it'll be a lot easier to coordinate those pickups and drop-offs, especially when there isn't a human driver to call you and make sure that you get there. And so that's effectively what this is. It's looking at ways to reimagine how we use our space on our roads. And there's also a great application here for paratransit services, because one of the biggest issues is you have to be able to find a curb space to drop someone off if they're in a wheelchair, and also have to find a ramp. And just an update from Washington, the House recently passed the Self-Drive Act, a bill that will, for the first time, maybe create laws around self-driving cars if this were to pass. And the Senate is now considering the AV START Act, which was just released on Thursday. And this is somewhat similar. I think we're going to have about six or more months until it actually passes, but I would probably defer to David on that one. And then at USDOT, Secretary Elaine Chao recently released sort of this guidance for how cities and states should prepare for AVs. And what this shows is the federal government is looking at it. Virginia is obviously looking at it, as you guys heard from Governor McAuliffe earlier. And cities now should be focusing on what their role can be in allowing AVs to continue to develop. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our presenters. And now we're going to open this session up to you all. We'd love to hear from you. Any questions that you may have for our panelists? And we're just taking questions, or am I going to do Phil Donahue and run out in the audience? That's me. All right. Who would like to ask a question?
I have a question about parking relative to economy. Economy was the last group, and this group has talked more about parking. And noticing how very many parking spaces in Charlottesville and urban Albemarle are right where businesses are located and people are located. What do you see are the possibilities of the shared vehicles being a boon for economic development in those areas?
Should I go first?
Please.
Okay. So I think in our studies that what we're showing is that you won't need nearly as much parking if we all shift towards this shared mobility mode. And you're right. Some of the most highly I guess, sought after land in Charlottesville, we have to fill it with some parking spots right now for people to be able to access those businesses. But in the future, you can imagine, we probably will always have some parking, but certainly we can greatly reduce the amount of land dedicated to parking, especially in very high-value zones like the downtown area. Also, if you think about the application, what I was specifically talking about, just the fact that we have all of that parking dedicated to Amtrak right there on West Main in the middle of town, right next to what could be much, much denser development. So I see a very exciting future for that.
I think that makes perfect sense. All I want to add is that it speaks to why, planning for bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure at the same time is so critical. Because I think that, part of last mile will be vehicles and part of last mile will be biking and walking. And so, I think that is, an essential part of the same force that's driving us toward driverless, or we might be able to use driverless vehicles as well to reduce parking needs.
That was exactly what I was going to say.
The conundrum right now for a lot of localities is making decisions about parking with the pressures that we're receiving from businesses and others. We want to see parking right now. We want to see it close to downtown, but then trying to prepare for that, anticipating that whatever we build now is supposed to last 30, 40, 50 years, but not knowing what type of shift we'll see in parking needs in the future. So it's just something that localities are really dealing with right now.
Yeah, and I think that it's important to say that, to commend the city of Charlottesville that, moving forward on a parking policy is an important part of that, because ultimately we still are in the present era, and we still do need to accommodate vehicles if we are, if we're expecting a certain level of economic activity. And I think that moving away from vehicles generally is part of that. And then managing the parking as best we can is hopefully a holding action, actually, until 20 years from now. But I think, how we manage the parking is then the question.
Delicate balance. Yeah. Absolutely. Other questions? In the back.
Yes, hi. Thank you, Mary. My question, you've got the mayor here, you have the city manager here, you have the head of economic development here from the city of Charlottesville. If they could do one thing in the next year, what would each of you recommend?
Wow.
Is the media still here?
Can I phone a friend?
Yes.
I would say it depends on what their goals are, right? First of all, making sure that you have the stakeholder group that has a set of goals, and then work with them on creating a pilot program for testing out how you can use AVs in Charlottesville. Do you want to help people get to transit connections, or do you want to help maybe students get around a little bit easier? Do you want to improve access to the city for people who live maybe on the outskirts? First of all, start with what your goals are. Start with the why. How do we want to do that? Do we want to do it with a driverless shuttle? And then what? I think is the best way to approach that.
I'm going to take the easy way out and say that this conversation we're having here today is a step in the right direction. I think this is one of the very few forums I've spoken to where we invite the general public to ask their questions and give input, and it has, I think, given all of us a different way to think about this. But also following on what Maurice was saying about parking policy, I think we, as cities, as planners, we should still stick to the basic principles of what our ultimate goal is, which is efficient access for all. And in this case, even before autonomous vehicles come onto the market, we can start thinking about, stopping to subsidize parking and having people pay what they actually incur as expenses in transportation. That way, they're already used to thinking about transportation in that way. And when the technology comes along, it becomes a smoother transition for them to say, hey, you know what? I had to pay for parking before, but now I can take this shared ride vehicle. I have to pay for the ride, but I no longer have to pay for the parking. Getting the marketplace more real in the first place will help that transition.
All I would add, and I hope I don't get in trouble with Maurice for saying this, is that there's a comprehensive planning effort going on right now in the city, and I honestly think every chapter in that document should acknowledge driverless vehicles in some way, or look at future mobility rather than current mobility in some way, and make it part of the engagement process as well. And I know that's a lot of work, so sorry about that.
With autonomous vehicles, what might a football game at Smith's Stadium look like? And then what might an evacuation plan look like for the city as well?
Do you want to talk about that?
Okay, sure. So let me background this answer by saying that typically we look at transportation planning as a typical day, right? Or we try to satisfy 85th percentile demand. So something like Scott Stadium football game would be 95th, 99th percentile traffic. It would be a special circumstance. That being said, right now for a city like Charlottesville, that is the perfect opportunity to pilot something like shared mobility, where we say, hey, instead of everybody driving their car to the football game, what if we somehow bring you guys onto shuttles and buses that can take you there easier? I think that can be done even prior to the introduction of autonomous vehicles. But certainly if we had autonomous vehicles, the ability to also have them situated in various places to bring then the access to these larger density vehicles can help in that effort.
That's what I can already check off. We already offer that on football days.
Oh, there you
So
go.
we have the trolley from downtown that takes folks, have folks park in one of the garages downtown, and we take folks to the game and back at the end. So, yes, ma'am. Over here, I think we have time for one more question, Lois.
In the emergency evacuation route. Emergency evacuation.
Emergency evacuation route. I think he wanted to touch on that if we could.
Yeah, I think that's a question that I don't think has really been thought through a lot quite yet. But it depends on what sort of ownership model we're looking at. If we're going to have shared fleets where, there's Uber and Lyft have a lot of the AVs, or a lot of the companies have them, or if you have your own AV, that's a big sort of question how this works. But I think it should be something that the companies maybe could be considering. Maybe that could be part of you having a subscription to your self-driving car service. And there's a potential here for National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, or even, I don't know, FEMA or Homeland Security to sort of look at how we would address these issues. But I haven't heard this discussed very much yet.
Well, I think that prompts just a little bit more, which is to say that I think one of the most important things that, again, falls on cities, again, and regions is that the technologies behind all of this are highly networked. They're highly complex. And I think the resiliency of those systems is important, and not just built into the system, but in the network that is the city as well. And so we really have to think about, if we become reliant on these vehicles, how do we ensure that if they fail, and maybe it's when they fail, how we continue to have evacuation plans, all of those sorts of things. That is critical, and we're not there yet, for sure.
And let me just add one more piece to that, which is the idea that, if we need to have this tie-in to private vehicle ownership to guarantee a baseline performance for something like an evacuation, I can say that's sort of a false sense of security. We know now that if everybody got in their cars and tried to evacuate an urban area at the same time, with even 2 people in a vehicle, there's not enough roadway capacity for everyone to do it. You'll just get stuck on the road. So that already is not a solution. So I think having networked transportation where you have different options. You can take a bus, you can take a shared ride, you can take a shared ride to a train. Having more options and having the ability to shift resources from, let's say a statewide model, if we're having, let's say, coastal evacuation from Norfolk, and we can shift resources from other regions towards that area for the temporary evacuation, we will still be better off with a networked strategy than we would having everybody saying, I'm getting my car and I'm getting on the highway.
My question is about transit. I feel like I appreciate in this session we've been bringing up transit, and I think that it's a key part of the conversation, but I don't see many transit agencies or stakeholders in this group. So one of the things I'm interested in your opinion on is how do we bring transit into this conversation in Virginia, in Charlottesville, and how do we, just your ideas on modernizing the transit fleet and bringing those transit stakeholders up to speed with self-driving features?
That is the million, if not billion-dollar question. To start off, I think that transit agencies have just in general been resistant to the idea of autonomous vehicles. In some ways, they feel like it could endanger their business model, but some have been very, very proactive about adopting them. Contra Costa, California is testing driverless shuttles on it. But I think it's about really reaching out and starting the conversation. And the potential here is great for automated buses. The technology is going to be there to where we can have a dedicated lane, and we can basically have bus rapid transit services for autonomous buses way earlier than most of us could actually buy our own fully self-driving cars. And it's also a challenging workforce question. There are definitely some unions who are concerned about losing a lot of those drivers' jobs. But I like to say that we could think about how the career of a bus driver might change to be more of a transit concierge. That person, their driving is really only 10% of their job. The other 90% is taking care of passengers. It's helping people with disabilities get on, collecting fares, et cetera.
I think it ultimately becomes a financial question and a question of cities and cities' responsibilities to their population to some degree. And I think that if we think that subsidized mobility is important, then that is transit in some way. And if it's in an automated vehicle, a connected automated vehicle, or a fixed route, whatever makes the most sense to supply the most people is probably what we should do. But then we have to think about how we spend our money. And I think it gets to your question about striping the roads. I don't think we always know how to pay for striping the roads. So I think it's a matter of public priority setting for how we spend money. And I think that, hopefully we continue to care about providing mobility to those who can't afford it in a private context. What it looks like, though, could be many different things, I suppose.
And I would also like to add to that I think we are making perhaps baby steps in that direction. So I, for one, have been attending the Virginia Transit Technology Roundtable, and this is a point of discussion, though it's still a little bit off, perhaps not immediate. But I think we could start with these pilot programs. So in Seattle, which I showed the demos, the reason why we were doing that work for them is because the transit agencies there are starting to have partner pilot programs with Uber and with Lyft to resolve that very problem I was talking about. But again, it has to be financially driven. For them, it was the expense of maintaining those park and ride lots that drove them to say, we need a different solution. So in that case, they were looking for perhaps just a very limited solution in addressing how do we address this expensive parking problem. But really, the solution is much more expansive than that. It includes shared mobility as a whole. So I think perhaps more conversations like this and maybe an organized strategy to say, hey, let's look at what shared mobility options could there be to complement your service. I think there is a lot of interest. I think we're all just a little unsure as to where to start in terms of pilot programs.
Hi, yes. I wanted to piggyback on the great question about what should we do next year. But I also wanted to piggyback and kind of add to that, to Greg's comment, I think, about I think with this type of technology, it's very tempting to think that we won't be able, who knows, how can we possibly predict what might happen, and to kind of take a very kind of passive approach to being prepared, whereas Greg said, we actually already have prototypes of what it's like to have a self-driving car when we take Lyft and Uber, even just taxi cabs and stuff. So I'd actually like to say, while we have people like Maurice and people here, what are the 3 prototypes we could try next year in Charlottesville to simulate some radical rethinking of our downtown suburban spaces, transportation options, to get a sense of what it might be like, what works, what doesn't for different groups of people within Charlottesville.
And is this for just the future of mobility in general, or for AVs or for AVs alone?
Well, I think that was my bad.
Yeah.
What I took as your point was, don't wait. You don't have to have driverless cars to prototype and propagate what it would be like to have a very different shared use, like what it means to have not owned your car as much, or have different parts of the city operate very differently. What are 2 prototypes, 3 prototypes, whatever Maurice thinks we have time for next year that could really give us a sense of that future right here in Charlotte?
Yeah, a lot of the solutions to our transportation problems look a lot like AVs because they basically could be AVs. The example is trying out just having a bus rapid transit system. You have a dedicated lane for a bus going both ways, and then you see what that looks like, and then you see what the frequency is, and you see how the city reacts, and you see if people actually want to use it. It's like one is using driverless shuttles, like the Easy Mile one that I showed earlier, to have those transit connections. And the third one, I'm just going to push my own idea here, but try out some zones, see if it works for you.
All I would add to that is that we should make sure then we're doing, if we're looking for experiences that model the future, we should also be, trying to close streets more often and have festivals and do the sorts of things that a future with driverless vehicles, we should want out of that future. So yeah, I think that's a great idea.
I think at a local level, I've had some conversations with Johns because they have basically kind of a mobility on demand, though it's reserved 24 hours and ahead kind of model, to see whether there are any synergies between a service like that and having sort of this automated feature that could really help them be more efficient.
All very good ideas, things that a number of those things are ideas that we've actually had some conversations with here in the city and with our friends in Albemarle County as well, bus rapid transit being one, especially the possibility of doing something like that on 29. It is wonderful to have those types of conversations in rooms like this, but when you go outside, you tend to get some opposition and pushback, and so that's part of that discussion that we have to have as a community. Where do we want to be in the future? What are we willing to give up at times in order to get there? And that's certainly an important conversation that we will have as a community, as a shared community with Charlottesville and Albemarle County and the whole region, especially on the issue of transit and the future of transit in our community as well. And we're having that discussion right now. Just a couple of weeks ago, the City Council met with the Board of Supervisors and agreed to a regional transit partnership where we're going to study these issues and develop a partnership that will be, I think, very proactive in looking at all of these types of issues and the impact it's going to have in our community, not just in the next 2 or 3 years, but the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And it goes well beyond Charlottesville and Albemarle. We're having discussions with folks in the Shenandoah Valley about commuter efforts between Waynesboro, Stanton, Harrisonburg, and Charlottesville and back. So a lot of really important communications between these localities that are happening right now. And I'm looking forward to them because it is a very exciting time to talk about these issues. So thank you to our panelists for being here, and thank you.